Kat, how prepared are you to survive any disaster? I'm a lot more prepared because I did this course from the Great Courses. No sponsorship, no money, no freebies. And I've used them for years, find them kind of interesting. They have online versions now, but I use the discs because online can go away. Speaking of which, my computer no longer hooks up to the internet, which is annoying to say the least, so I'm doing what I originally figured, and I'm going to download the hard drive for the time being and then upload when I get to civilization. But because of my last 15 years of buying these, we have a ton of these to watch. So what's the point in a prepper, even a useless prepper like me and a clueless off-gridder like me, doing a course like this? It never hurts to do a formalized course in a topic or a hobby or interest that you're very interested in at a beginner level. It really is a great way of reassociating yourself with your roots. It's a great way of looking at things you may have misjudged, that you may have not thought about from somebody else's perspective. In this specific case, his perspective. Now, I enjoyed the course. Is it worth the money? Possibly not. I got this for $29.99 because I only ever buy these when they go on offer. It would be very useful for somebody without much of a preparedness background. It really does cover heavily FEMA and IMS and American-based stuff, which is always a pity because there's more to the world than that and there's more to prepping than that. But you can understand the previous economic powerhouse that was the United States does in fact dominate a lot of entertainment and education. Well, let's get into it, shall we?
The earth starts shaking beneath your feet. You hear a low rumble that's growing louder, and cracks have just formed in the plaster on the wall and the glass in the windows. Objects are falling from shelves and the power is flickering in and out. What should you do? And what could you do to be ready for this?
Obviously, if you live in an earthquake area, you should know what to do, and hopefully you're going to answer that right now before he tells you. But you also need to know this sort of stuff for various other things not related to earthquakes. For example, if you're in a building that has a structural collapse, or if a bomb goes off near the building you're in and the building starts to suffer a structural collapse. What works in an earthquake also works in those scenarios.
For an immediate response, use drop, cover, hold. Drop to get under cover provided by a strong piece of furniture, and hold on until the shaking stops.
As we all should know by now in 2021, humans respond much better to narrative stories than they do to statistics. One of the interesting things about this course, they actually feature a major disaster, a different one, in each episode, and use that to illustrate the points he's trying to make and also to show why people should get prepared for disaster, not fear disaster.
Let me give you another scenario. The power has just gone out, leaving you in the dark. Your cell phone still has a charge, so you navigate to your favorite news app and learn that a catastrophic failure of the power grid has occurred. And preliminary reports are that you may be without power for up to a week, if not longer, before everything is back online. You quickly click your phone off, saving the power that you have left.
One of the problems I have with the course is that they do actually focus on mostly localized disasters and personal response in the 2-week to 4-week period. And that's great given the fact that most people aren't prepared for 3 days or a day of a disaster, and it's a good idea if people do this and follow it and actually learn from it. Not that history is showing us that they are. But what about this scenario? Power's gone out, you check your phone is still working, okay, probably wouldn't be, but let's assume it is, and CNN is telling you there's been a catastrophic power outage. What do you do next?
But now you're alone. What should you do? And what could you do to be ready for this? Hopefully you have a flashlight with batteries or a dynamo charger, and perhaps even an old-fashioned radio with batteries. If your house has a generator, hopefully it's fueled up. Without electricity to cook, run climate control, keep food refrigerated, pump gas, get cash from ATMs or run credit cards, much less operate lights, water pumps, and electronic devices, evacuation may become an option for some.
I find that kind of interesting. As a prepper, I'm actually prepared for that type of a scenario, and it shouldn't drive me into evacuation. Now I have bugged out to my retirement property off-grid. But the vast majority of people who live in North America and around the world, he's quite right. Without the safety net of modern technology, they're going to be in trouble quite quickly. I would have a different set of responses to this. I would be looking at my fridge and freezer and looking at using and preserving the food that is otherwise going to spoil within 24 hours depending on the temperature. I'd be looking at security, I'd be looking at wood fires, I'd be looking at water supply, I'd be looking at sanitation. I wouldn't be just going, help. The most important thing I think of this is when he said, and now you're on your own. And a lot of preppers fall into that category as well. What do you do if the lights go out and you can't find out why and they don't never come on again? That's one of the scenarios we might face here because we are kind of miles from anywhere. We have neighbours, we have friends, we have people in the area, we have a network. We wouldn't be on our own in that scenario. And I think that's the single most important prep. For most people, not being on their own means their family. Have a good look at your family, have a good look at your friends, have a good look at your neighbours. Make sure that if things go badly wrong and don't ever get better or don't get better for weeks to months, your support network is already in place. Not really mentioned too strongly in this course, but I think it's the most vital lesson that I have took from prepping over the last few years.
Here's a third situation that is sadly all too common on the evening news. A person enters a building with intent to do harm to others.
Prepping generally focuses on the dramatic, and school shootings aren't really a thing for me in Canada, so I'm skipping that. If you want to see what he has to say about it, get the course.
We can prepare. In the field of emergency management, being prepared leads to disaster resilience. That's the goal of being able to cope with and move forward from disasters. And that, in turn, is what this course is all about.
And I'm really happy about that, if that's in fact what the course turns out to be all about. Because prepping shouldn't be surviving the disaster and the event. Prepping should be helping others survive the disaster and event and then rebuilding the local and national networks that have collapsed or been seriously compromised by the event or the events. As we all know, having one event is highly unlikely. There's probably going to be a flood, an earthquake and electric out and possibly a cholera epidemic at the same time.
The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, helps to support this.
Only in the United States of America. The rest of the world have similar systems. It's popular online from certain types of preppers to attack FEMA continually. That's like attacking a safety belt because the car's expensive. They actually do some really good work and they actually are really important, especially in economically deprived areas, to help people and businesses recover. Are they perfect? No. Is there corruption? Yes. Are they a government agency? Yes. But they are full of volunteers. They're full of people who are working very hard, not to incarcerate people in Walmart, but to actually help people who've suffered a disaster. And you need to go to the FEMA sites and you need to look at their stuff because it's actually interesting and it's actually relevant to prepping, even if politically you don't like the whole concept of the government trying to help its population in a disaster.
In fact, from 2005 through 2018, FEMA has allocated over $37 billion to help the nation get ready.
That's a lot of money. And I know in parts of the States they have earthquake barrels in schools and places like that with food and water and flashlights and raincoats and stuff in for a disaster, and that's really good. I'd like to see more organizational prepping from the government. Just merely relying on the population to get it and start to prep isn't really helpful. Yeah, there's a subset of the population like me that's really got it and doesn't need to be even told really because we're prepping hard. But the majority of people are not.
But here's why I think this course is so important. It's not enough to assume that help will always be here. Our first responders are valiant in their work during a disaster, and so are the scores of volunteers who selflessly ask, what can we do to help? Ultimately, though, we all need to be prepared personally.
I am Huples Cat, and I approve of this message.
Now, I'll be honest, this may take us to some rather dark places in our conversation.
Goody.
Those of us who work with emergency planning and disaster preparedness regularly review what are called AARs. That's an acronym for After Action Report.
Unfortunately, I can't link in Preparedness Veterans' excellent video on After Action Reports. I've done one or two myself. It is really important after an event to sit down and be really brutally honest about how you responded and what could have been done better, not just about what went right.
This time, it's the 1997 flood in the Red River Valley, and particularly in Grand Forks, North Dakota, and East Grand Forks, Minnesota. It was April of 1997, and meteorologists had already predicted that it was going to be a rough year for floods.
As I'm making this video, meteorologists actually forecast massive heavy flooding in Seattle and Canada, and that was kind of ignored, and the flooding came, and the Fraser Valley is having major problems and probably has loss of life, but definitely had hundreds of people trapped in vehicles for a 24-hour period between a landslide and a raging river. What's in your car to make that experience safer and more comfortable for you?
As early as February, the warnings had started. And they didn't pull any punches. The Weather Service advised that residents should prepare for, and this is a quote, the highest floods in 150 years. The weather leading to April of 1997 brought a combination of heavy rains in the fall that saturated the ground, followed by heavy snow in the winter, a rapid temperature increase that led to large amounts of snowmelt, and additional spring rain. That's enough to challenge any river basin, and flooding was inevitable. And flood it did.
We live in a post-expert world, apparently, and I disagree with that. When experts are telling you it's going to flood or fire is likely in your area, do things ahead of time to be able to evacuate and also to be able to mitigate the area's disasters upon your place. Absolutely, that makes sense. Meteorologists are very smart people. One of the things that I think is really important here is to know what's coming, and you need to know that in your local area. For example, here I probably wouldn't get too much meteorological input into letting me know I'm really likely to have mega floods in a particular year, but I can look at snowmelt, I can look at temperatures, I can look at conditions, I can look at how saturated the ground is on a regular basis, and I can decide that there's a huge probability of flood this year rather than low probability. Be aware of your local environment. That doesn't just mean knowing where to go and raid people's houses for ammunition in an apocalypse. It means knowing the river basins, it means knowing where the actual floodplains are and how likely a 1,000-year flood or a 10,000-year flood is to actually affect your personal property and your own personal safety. For example, in the Fraser Valley, why were those people even on the roads? Why hadn't the government closed the roads? They didn't. People act after the information has already been there telling them what to do because we don't want to inconvenience anybody. Well, we don't want to kill them either, do we? On a personal level, it's up to you to protect yourself and your family and your local community. Don't dismiss experts, don't dismiss information, try and gather information and then use it effectively.
I'd like you to pause for a moment for a question. What kind of impacts do you think a flooding event like this one could bring? Consider record high water, ominous warnings. Sandbags just aren't going to be enough, even though 3.5 million sandbags were used to try to hold the waters back. What are the probable results?
Road, rail, bridge infrastructure is going to be removed for a period of time. Sanitation is going to fail. Infectious diseases and contaminated water is highly likely. And as we shall see, flooding also, as well as earthquakes, brings a secondary danger, which when it happens can be overwhelming. And the response is interesting.
First, the evacuations. Grand Forks had a population of approximately 52,000 at the time, and 90% had to evacuate. 90%. That's almost the entire town. The entire town of East Grand Forks did have to evacuate. That's a 100% evacuation of 9,000 persons. Where do 55,800 people go?
In a localized event, we figure it out. We find places for them to go, as they did with Grand Forks in 1997. But in a national or a multinational event, there will be nowhere to go. This is why prepping is so important for the individual and for your family and for more than 72 hours. If it is a mega ice storm, a mega snowstorm across most of America's east and Canada's east and central areas, there won't be any help for an awfully long time. And with the cold and the lack of food and the lack of clean water, there is a huge danger here that you could die before official help recovers enough to get to you and to try and do something useful for you. To be evacuated out may not happen, may in fact be impossible. That's a worst case natural type disaster. We need to be thinking along those lines rather than just, oh, I've got 3 tins of beans in the fridge, I'll be fine.
FEMA described this, and this is a quote, as one of the largest peacetime evacuations in U.S. history. A neighboring Air Force base accommodated some. Others went to stay with family and friends. But what about those who were sick and hospitalized? For about 3 weeks, the local hospital was closed. Its patients airlifted to other facilities, and arrangements were made for those with chronic conditions who needed specialized care.
It's not going to happen in a national, multinational disaster. People aren't going to get airlifted out because they happen to be in hospital. The hospitals may be abandoned with your loved ones in the hospital. Are you able to retrieve them safely, depending on what the event is? Can you look after them professionally and carefully, until you get care again? It's a big tricky question. It's like a pie, right? Prepping is like this big pie, and if you just look at the crust, it's sweet and delicious. It's quite easy to figure out how to eat it. When you start digging into that pie, you realise that you can never be fully prepped. You can never be safe 100% from any event. What you can be is more aware of the factors that could come and how they would affect you personally, your local community personally, and try to think about easy and cheap methods of bypassing those restrictions if they actually occur during any sort of mega event. Just rely on helicopters to show up is not a plan.
Then the fires came. While the cause is uncertain, it appears they may have been ignited by electrical equipment that was short-circuited by the floodwaters. The fires spread from one downtown building to another, and 11 buildings were destroyed by that fire, illustrating the irony of being unable to fight a fire when surrounded by water. But the fire trucks just couldn't make it through.
Too bad, too sad. What would you do if you were the head of FEMA, which didn't exist at that time in 1997? How would you get the fire trucks through a flood zone into a downtown core that's on fire? Would you even bother? Would you even try? Well, these guys did. Individual flexible response is also part of prepping and also part of emergency management. Just going, well, there's nothing we can do, and giving up isn't ever going to help. Now, doing things that are dangerous and can result in further loss of life, yeah, you should not be doing that. But they figured out an answer to this, and it's quite an interesting one.
I'd like for you to picture a couple of images. One is airdropping chemicals over the block that was burning to put out the fire. That's usually something reserved for wildfire suppression. Another is fire engines being moved in on flatbed trucks that could navigate the waters and fighting the fires from their perches on the back of the trucks.
Both of those responses illustrate what's very fundamentally important to me as a prepper, and that's flexibility and imagination of response. Just having a plan and sticking religiously to it is never going to function. Always, any plan is going to fail very quickly when encountering the scenario it's been designed for before it happens. So using technology, using equipment differently than what you actually plan to do for it is actually a really good idea. For example, if you have a whole bunch of alcohol that you just use for bartering, make sure it's vodka, because you can use that medically as well, both to drink but also as a sterilizing agent. You can use it on your knives to sterilize them if you need to do any debridement of skin or cut anything open because of the swelling of the tissue. Lots of things you can do with things that you actually may already have but wouldn't typically do, but you may have to do in an emergency, and think about it.
Of course, the waters receded, as flood waters eventually do. The damage? Estimated at $4 billion. No potable water for 3 weeks. But would you believe that 20,000 volunteers came to help? I hope so, because they did.
Illustrating one of the big myths of prepping, which is incorrect, is that people are very selfish and immediately become animals and attack you. If you live in a high crime area, that might happen in an event. But generally speaking, the majority of people will hold it together and actually suffer hugely and take huge risks to help strangers in a catastrophic sudden event. It's happened time and time again in human history. The idea of the lone wolf and the violent sniper on top of the Walmart is a myth.
83% of the homes and 62% of businesses were damaged. 17 persons lost their lives due to the winter weather and the floods that followed. In the aftermath, $1 billion in flood control measures were implemented as a result of this incident.
If they'd spent that $1 billion in advance, they would have saved over $3 billion of damage and actually saved a lot of lives and damage and disruption that's not really accounted for in economic terms. And it's the same with prepping. You can spend a little bit of money now and never need to use it, and it's a form of insurance and you've wasted that money. But if you ever need it, it's way more cost effective to have water and food in store and good clothing for winter in store now than it is to try and get it when the power goes out in January. If you live in the Northern Hemisphere. July, of course, in Australia, though I don't think it gets that cold in Australia, but it gets cold.
This included levees and creating what's known as a greenway, taking an area that's known to flood, buying out the properties, and helping to relocate people elsewhere. The greenway can also absorb floodwaters, and cleared of properties, there are no longer structures there that would be flooded.
On a personal level, there's no particular reason why you can't recreate a greenway on a small scale on your own property to try and protect where the flooding is likely to come from.
In 2009, there was an even higher flood, and Grand Forks and East Grand Forks stayed dry.
So that's forest snow. It's fallen on Puffin. He will remove it before he gets cold. Wolfie, wait. Got snow on your head. Good boy. Onwards.